A rifle shot echoed through the valley, spooking a flock of sparrows from the cottonwood tree as Elizabeth Bentley froze at her wash basin, water dripping from her raw hands. That sound meant nothing and everything in Dakota Territory, 1876, just another day in Silverstone, or perhaps the moment her life would change forever. Elizabeth wiped her hands on her apron and stepped out onto the porch of the modest homestead she and her husband Charles had built 3 years ago when they'd moved west from Pennsylvania. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across their small plot of land, 40 acres they'd claimed under the Homestead Act, with dreams as vast as the prairie sky. At 24, Elizabeth had already weathered more hardships than most women twice her age. Charles should have been back by noon, she muttered to herself, shielding her eyes as she scanned the horizon where the rutted dirt road disappeared into a grove of trees. Her husband had left yesterday morning for Silverstone, just 8 miles east, to sell their first small wool harvest from the sheep they'd been raising. A simple overnight trip to town, he'd promised. Just need to speak with Mr. Whitaker about those fencing supplies and settle accounts with the general store, he'd said as he kissed her goodbye. I'll be back before supper tomorrow, Lizzie. Don't you worry. But the sun was already beginning its descent, and there was no sign of Charles or their wagon. Elizabeth returned to her chores, trying to ignore the knot of worry growing in her stomach. Charles had never been late before, not once in their 5 years of marriage. As dusk approached, Elizabeth lit the oil lamps and prepared a simple supper of beans and cornbread, setting the table for 2 as always. When the food grew cold and the night grew dark, she finally admitted to herself that something was wrong. That night, she slept fitfully, jolting awake at every sound, the creak of the house settling, the distant howl of coyotes, the rustling of wind through the prairie grass. By dawn, she had made up her mind. If Charles didn't appear by midday, she would saddle their old mare and ride to town herself. Midday came and went. Elizabeth had just finished securing the saddle when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Relief washed over her, but only for a moment. It wasn't Charles's wagon. It was a lone rider on a chestnut stallion. The stranger's silhouette grew larger against the western sky as he approached her homestead. Elizabeth reached inside the doorway and grabbed Charles's shotgun, holding it at her side as the rider drew near. Out here, a woman alone couldn't be too careful. The man pulled his horse to a stop and removed his hat, a gesture of respect. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with sun-weathered skin and eyes that reminded her of the sky before a storm. The silver star pinned to his vest identified him before he spoke. "Mrs. Bentley?" he called. "That's right," she answered, tightening her grip on the shotgun. "Name's Xavier Kincaid. I'm the new deputy marshal out of Silverstone." He dismounted with the easy grace of a man who'd spent his life in the saddle. "May I have a word?" Elizabeth felt her mouth go dry. Lawmen didn't ride 8 miles to deliver good news. "What's happened to my husband?" Deputy Kincaid's expression softened. "Madam, I think we should sit down." The next few minutes blurred together as Xavier Kincaid explained what little they knew. Charles had been found on the road about 3 miles outside of town, the wagon and wool missing, their horse slaughtered. He'd been shot through the chest. By the time a traveling peddler discovered him, it was too late. "Bandits, most likely," Kincaid said, his voice gentle but matter-of-fact. "There's been a gang working the territory. Marshal Harrison is gathering a posse, but he trailed off, both of them knowing what remained unsaid. The killers were likely long gone, and justice was a luxury few could afford in the Dakota Territory." Elizabeth sat perfectly still on her porch rocker, her body numb, her mind unable to process the deputy's words. Charles was dead. Her husband, her partner, the only family she had left in the world, gone. "Mrs. Bentley?" Kincaid's voice seemed to come from far away. "Is there someone I can fetch for you? Anyone nearby who could stay with you?" Elizabeth shook her head slowly. Their nearest neighbors, the Johnsons, were 5 miles west, and she barely knew them. Everyone else was scattered across the territory, isolated on their own homesteads, fighting their own battles against the harsh land. "No," she said finally. "There's no one." Deputy Kincaid ran a hand through his dark hair, clearly uncomfortable with leaving a woman alone in her grief, but equally constrained by his duties. "I'm sorry, madam, truly. The undertaker will... Well, once the marshal completes his investigation, you can make arrangements." Elizabeth nodded mechanically, still clutching the shotgun across her lap. "Thank you for riding out to tell me." Kincaid hesitated, then reached into his saddlebag. "I brought your husband's personal effects." He handed her a small cloth bundle. "It ain't much. The thieves took his money and pocket watch." Inside the bundle, Elizabeth found Charles's wedding ring, a folded handkerchief she had embroidered for him last Christmas, and a crumpled piece of paper, the deed to their land. She closed her eyes, fighting back tears that refused to fall. Later, she would cry. Later, she would scream and rage against God and fate and the cruelty of men. But not now. Not in front of this stranger. "Will you be all right out here alone?" Kincaid asked, genuine concern in his voice. "I have been alone most of my life, Deputy," Elizabeth said, the truth of the words hitting her as she spoke them. Her parents had died of fever when she was 16, leaving her to work as a seamstress in Philadelphia until she met and married Charles at 19. "I can manage," Kincaid nodded, though he didn't look convinced. "I'll check on you when I can, Mrs. Bentley. In the meantime, keep that shotgun close." After the deputy rode away, Elizabeth sat motionless on the porch until the sun disappeared behind the hills. The crickets began their evening chorus, and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Only then did she allow herself to break. She sobbed until her throat was raw and her eyes swollen, clutching Charles's handkerchief to her chest. That night, she didn't sleep at all. She sat by the window with the shotgun across her lap, watching the dark prairie, wondering how she would survive without Charles. They'd sunk everything they had into this land that was now hers alone to work, to protect, to make yield enough to live on. As dawn broke, Elizabeth made a decision. She would not abandon what she and Charles had built together. She would not return east defeated. This was her home now, and she would fight for it with every ounce of strength she possessed. The next week passed in a blur of grief and practicality. Elizabeth buried Charles in a simple ceremony, attended only by Deputy Kincaid, the town preacher, and the Johnsons, who had ridden over upon hearing the news. She declined Mrs. Johnson's offer to stay with them, determined to stand on her own. Each day, Elizabeth forced herself to complete the essential chores, feeding the chickens and remaining sheep, tending the vegetable garden, mending fences. Each night, she collapsed into bed, exhausted but still vigilant, the shotgun always within reach. By the second week, reality began to set in. The fencing supplies Charles had gone to town for were still needed. The sheep required shearing. The roof had started leaking over the kitchen, and their small cash reserves were dwindling faster than she'd anticipated. Elizabeth had just finished patching the roof as best she could when she saw a rider approaching from the east. Climbing down from the ladder, she reached for the shotgun, a habit now, before recognizing Deputy Kincaid's chestnut stallion. "Afternoon, Mrs. Bentley," he called as he neared the house. "Deputy," she acknowledged with a nod. "Any news?" Xavier Kincaid dismounted and removed his hat. "No, madam, I'm afraid not. The trail went cold at the North Fork. Marshal thinks they've crossed into Montana Territory." Elizabeth's shoulders sagged slightly, though she hadn't really expected justice. "I see." The deputy shifted uncomfortably. "How are you managing out here?" "Well enough," she lied, acutely aware of her disheveled appearance. Her dress was stained with dirt and sweat, her hair escaping its pins, her hands raw and blistered from unaccustomed labor. Kincaid's eyes took in the precarious roof patch, the broken wagon wheel she'd been attempting to fix, and the diminished flock of sheep. "Mrs. Bentley, forgive my bluntness, but this is too much for any one person to handle, let alone—" "A woman," she finished for him, a spark of defiance flaring despite her exhaustion. "I was going to say, someone in mourning," he corrected gently. "Have you considered selling the homestead? There are folks in town who'd pay fair price. You could go back east, be with family." "I have no family," Elizabeth said flatly, "and I'm not selling. This land is all I have left." Xavier nodded, as if he'd expected nothing less. "Then you'll need help." He gestured toward the broken wagon wheel. "May I?" Without waiting for her permission, he removed his vest and rolled up his sleeves, revealing forearms corded with muscle. For the next 2 hours, Elizabeth watched in silence as the deputy repaired the wagon wheel, reinforced her roof patch, and mended a section of fence that had been threatening to collapse. As the sun began to set, Xavier returned to his horse. "I've got to get back to town before dark, but I'll return on Sunday. There's more that needs fixing." "Why?" Elizabeth asked, suspicious of his motives. Men didn't offer help without expecting something in return. That was one of the first lessons she'd learned growing up in Philadelphia. Xavier paused, one foot in the stirrup. "Because it's the right thing to do, madam, and because no one should have to face this wilderness alone." True to his word, Deputy Kincaid returned on Sunday, and the next, and the one after that. Each visit, he tackled the most pressing repairs around the homestead, working silently and efficiently while Elizabeth continued with her own chores. They rarely spoke beyond necessary exchanges about the work at hand, but Elizabeth gradually became accustomed to his presence, even looking forward to the sound of hoofbeats that signaled his arrival. One Sunday in early August, nearly 2 months after Charles's death, Xavier arrived with his saddlebags bulging. "I've brought some supplies," he said, unpacking salt, coffee, sugar, and several cans of Peach's luxuries Elizabeth hadn't been able to afford. "I can't accept these," she protested, even as her mouth watered at the sight of the peaches. Fresh fruit was scarce on the prairie. "Consider it payment for the meal you're about to offer me," Xavier said with a hint of a smile. "I'm mighty hungry after that ride." Elizabeth hesitated, then nodded. It would be churlish to refuse such a practical arrangement. "I don't have much, but you're welcome to share what I have." That evening, they sat at her small table sharing a simple meal of rabbit stew and cornbread. For the first time, conversation flowed between them as Xavier told stories of his life before becoming a lawman, how he'd been a Union soldier during the war, then a cattle driver, a silver miner, and even briefly a stunt rider with a traveling show. "What brought you to Dakota Territory?" Elizabeth asked, surprised to find herself genuinely interested. Xavier's expression grew more serious. "Looking for a fresh start, I suppose. Somewhere I could be useful." He glanced around her small cabin. "What about you and your husband? What made you leave Pennsylvania?" Elizabeth's throat tightened at the mention of Charles, but she found she wanted to answer. Charles had a cousin who homesteaded in Nebraska. His letters made it sound like paradise, free land, opportunity. When my parents died and left nothing but debts, Charles suggested we try our luck out west. She gave a small, sad smile. He was always full of dreams. "Were any of them realized?" Xavier asked softly. Elizabeth considered the question, looking around the cabin she and Charles had built with their own hands. "Some. We were happy here, despite the hardships. Charles believed in this place. He used to say that someday this would be the most prosperous farm in the territory." They lapsed into companionable silence as twilight deepened outside the windows. Finally, Xavier stood to leave. "Thank you for the meal, Mrs. Bentley." "Elizabeth," she said impulsively. "Please call me Elizabeth." Something shifted in Xavier's expression, surprise perhaps, or pleasure. "Elizabeth," he repeated, as if testing the sound of it. "I'll see you next Sunday, Elizabeth." As summer gave way to autumn, Elizabeth found herself counting the days between Xavier's visits. Each Sunday, he would arrive with some small gift, a book from the marshal's personal library, a jar of honey from the general storekeeper's hives, once even a length of pretty blue ribbon that Elizabeth used to trim her one good bonnet. In return, she began preparing special meals for his visits, using precious ingredients she would normally save. They would eat together at her table, talking long into the evening about everything and nothing, books they had read, places they had seen, dreams they once held. Elizabeth realized she was learning Xavier Kincaid in a way she had never known Charles. Her marriage had been one of convenience and mutual respect rather than passionate love. Charles had been kind but reserved, never sharing his innermost thoughts. With Xavier, conversation flowed easily, punctuated by laughter that gradually drove back the shadows of grief. But as autumn deepened, Elizabeth's anxiety grew. Winter on the Dakota Prairie was brutal, and despite Xavier's help, her preparations were inadequate. The garden had yielded poorly due to a dry summer, the sheep had produced less wool than expected, and there was the matter of firewood. She simply couldn't chop enough to last the winter. One Sunday, in late October, as the first frost sparkled on the grass, Elizabeth finally voiced her fears. "I don't think I can make it through winter here alone," she admitted, the words painful to speak aloud. Xavier was silent for a long moment. "I've been thinking the same," he said finally. "Elizabeth, would you consider moving into town for the winter? Mrs. Peterson, the widow who runs the boarding house, has a room available. You could take a few belongings and your most valuable livestock. I'd help you secure the homestead until spring." Elizabeth's pride rebelled at the suggestion. "I can't afford room and board for months on end. Mrs. Peterson needs help with sewing and cooking. She'd take your labor as payment." Xavier hesitated, then added, "And you'd be safer in town. Those bandits who killed Charles, they've struck twice more along the eastern road." The mention of the bandits sent a chill through Elizabeth that had nothing to do with the autumn air. She hadn't allowed herself to dwell on the danger, focusing instead on the daily struggle to survive. But Xavier was right. A woman alone on an isolated homestead would be an easy target. "I'll think about it," she said finally. Xavier nodded, clearly wanting to press the point but respecting her need to make her own decision. "That's all I ask." A week later, before Xavier's regular Sunday visit, a powerful storm swept across the prairie. Wind howled through the cracks in Elizabeth's cabin walls, and rain hammered against the roof until she was certain it would collapse. When dawn finally broke, she discovered that half the sheep pen had been destroyed, allowing several animals to escape into the grassland. Elizabeth spent hours searching for the missing sheep, eventually finding all but 2. Exhausted and soaked to the skin, she returned to the cabin only to find that the roof had indeed sprung a serious leak, soaking her bed and much of her winter food stores. As she surveyed the damage, Elizabeth made her decision. She would take Xavier's advice and move to town for the winter. It wasn't surrender, she told herself, merely a strategic retreat. She would return in the spring and rebuild. When Xavier arrived the next day and found her packing, relief washed over his features. "You've made the right choice," he said, helping her gather the most essential items. "We'll need to make 2 trips with the wagon to transport your things and the remaining sheep." They worked together efficiently, loading the wagon with Elizabeth's clothing, bedding, her mother's china set, and tools she couldn't bear to leave behind. The first snowflakes began to fall as they set out for town, the sheep bleating nervously behind the wagon. Silverstone was hardly more than a wide spot in the road, a main street lined with false-fronted buildings, a few side streets of modest homes, and outlying farms and ranches scattered across the rolling prairie. The town had sprung up to serve the stagecoach line and the occasional mining expedition, growing slowly but steadily over the past decade. Mrs. Peterson's boarding house stood at the quieter end of Main Street, a 2-story white-clapboard building with green shutters and a wide front porch. The widow herself came out to greet them as Xavier helped Elizabeth down from the wagon. "So you're the Bentley widow," Mrs. Peterson said, assessing Elizabeth with kind but shrewd eyes. "Deputy Kincaid's told me about your situation. We'll get you settled right in." Elizabeth's room at the boarding house was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a chest of drawers. The window overlooked the back garden, now dormant for winter, and beyond it, the endless expanse of prairie. Mrs. Peterson showed her to the communal dining room and kitchen, where Elizabeth would help prepare meals for the boarders, currently 2 schoolteachers, a clerk from the general store, and an elderly gentleman who had once been the town's only doctor. "Supper's at 6 sharp," Mrs. Peterson informed her. Until then, rest and get yourself settled. You look dead on your feet, child." Elizabeth was too exhausted to take offense at being called child by a woman barely 10 years her senior. She thanked Mrs. Peterson and returned to her room, where she sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly overcome by the magnitude of the change. For the first time since Charles's death, she was surrounded by the sounds of other human beings, footsteps in the hallway, muffled voices, the clatter of dishes from the kitchen below. The constant solitude of the homestead had become so familiar that its absence left her feeling strangely exposed. A soft knock at her door roused her from her thoughts. Xavier stood in the hallway, hat in hand. "I've arranged for your sheep to be kept at the livery stable," he said. "Old man Jenkins will look after them for a small fee, which I've covered until the new year." "I can't let you," Elizabeth began to protest. "Consider it an advance on the wool," Xavier interrupted. "Jenkins has agreed to purchase your spring shearing at a fair price." Elizabeth recognized the arrangement for what it was, Xavier's way of preserving her pride while ensuring she had at least some income. "Thank you," she said simply. Xavier nodded, seemingly embarrassed by her gratitude. "I need to get back to my duties, but I'll check on you tomorrow." He hesitated, then added, "I'm glad you're here, Elizabeth. This winter would have been difficult for you out there alone." As he turned to leave, Elizabeth impulsively reached out to touch his arm. "Xavier, I don't know how I'll ever repay your kindness." The deputy's eyes met hers, and something in his gaze made her heart beat faster. "You already have," he said softly, "by accepting it." Life at the boarding house quickly fell into a rhythm. Elizabeth rose early to help Mrs. Peterson prepare breakfast for the boarders, spent her mornings sewing and mending for the widow's small dressmaking business, and in the afternoons assisted with cleaning and supper preparations. The work was familiar and far less grueling than maintaining the homestead had been, leaving her with energy to join the other boarders in the parlor for occasional games of cards or reading aloud from the latest newspapers and novels. Xavier visited when his duties allowed, sometimes just for a quick cup of coffee in the kitchen, other times staying for supper and the evening's entertainment. Elizabeth found herself watching the clock on days when he was expected, a fluttering sensation in her stomach that both alarmed and excited her. "The deputy's sweet on you," Mrs. Peterson observed one afternoon as they kneaded bread dough side by side. "Has been since he first mentioned bringing you to town." Elizabeth felt her cheeks grow warm. "We're friends, nothing more. My husband's only been gone 5 months." Mrs. Peterson made a non-committal sound. "Time moves differently out here, child. Life is too harsh and too short to waste it following rules made by people who've never known real hardship." She glanced sideways at Elizabeth. "And if I'm not mistaken, you're developing a certain fondness for the deputy yourself." Elizabeth couldn't deny it, though she tried to push the feelings aside. It seemed disloyal to Charles's memory to be developing an attachment to another man so soon. Yet Xavier had become essential to her in a way that went beyond gratitude for his assistance. She found herself storing up observations and thoughts throughout the day to share with him, anticipating his reactions, his laugh, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. As December brought deeper snows and bitter cold, Elizabeth heard rumors of increasing bandit activity. The stage had been robbed twice, and a ranch 15 miles north had been raided, the owner killed, and his winter stores stolen. Xavier and Marshal Harrison spent more time on patrol, and Elizabeth saw less of the deputy, intensifying her worry and, she admitted to herself, her longing for his company. 2 days before Christmas, a blizzard howled down from the north, burying Silverstone under 3 feet of snow and isolating the town completely. Trapped indoors, the boarding house residents decorated a small pine tree Mrs. Peterson's son had cut before the storm, strung popcorn garlands, and prepared for a modest Christmas celebration. On Christmas Eve, as twilight deepened into night and the storm finally began to subside, Elizabeth sat by the parlor window watching the snow fall and thinking of Christmases past of her parents, of Charles, of the life she had imagined for herself that now seemed like a distant dream. The sound of the front door opening startled her from her reverie. Heavy boots stamped snow from the porch, and then Xavier appeared in the parlor doorway, his coat and hat crusted with ice, his face red from the cold. "Xavier," Elizabeth rose quickly, alarmed by his appearance. "What on earth were you doing out in this weather?" "Patrol," he said, removing his hat and revealing hair damp with melted snow. Marshall wanted to make sure no one was stranded on the roads. His eyes moved to the Christmas tree, and his expression softened. It looks like I made it back just in time." Mrs. Peterson bustled in with a mug of hot cider, which she thrust into Xavier's hands. "Drink this before you catch your death, Deputy, then come join us for supper. We're celebrating tonight since tomorrow's Christmas Day." The Christmas Eve supper was the most festive meal Elizabeth had experienced since coming to Dakota Territory. Mrs. Peterson had somehow procured a ham despite the storm, and the table groaned with dishes contributed by each resident: spiced apples, cornbread stuffing, boiled potatoes with butter, and for dessert, a dried apple pie with precious cinnamon from Mrs. Peterson's carefully hoarded spices. After the meal, they gathered in the parlor around the small tree. To Elizabeth's surprise, there were modest gifts for everyone: handkerchiefs embroidered by Mrs. Peterson for the gentlemen, peppermint sticks for all, a knitted scarf for Elizabeth from the school teachers who had noticed she had none. When the others had retired to their rooms, Elizabeth remained in the parlor, reluctant to end the pleasant evening. Xavier lingered as well, standing by the dying fire. "I have something for you," he said suddenly, reaching into his coat pocket. "It isn't much." He handed her a small package wrapped in brown paper and string. Elizabeth unwrapped it carefully to find a book of poetry by Emily Dickinson, its leather binding worn but well cared for. "It was my mother's," Xavier explained. "You mentioned once that you enjoyed poetry, and this has been sitting unread in my quarters for years." Elizabeth ran her fingers over the gilt-edged pages, deeply moved by the personal nature of the gift. "Xavier, I can't accept this. It's a family heirloom." "I have no family left to pass it to," he said simply. "I'd like you to have it." Elizabeth looked up at him, suddenly aware of how close they were standing, of the way the firelight cast shadows across his strong features, softening them. "I didn't get you anything," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't need to give me anything," Xavier replied, his eyes holding hers. "Just promise me you'll read it sometimes and think of me." Before she could respond, he leaned down and pressed his lips gently to her forehead, a gesture so tender it brought tears to her eyes. "Merry Christmas, Elizabeth," he murmured, and then he was gone, leaving her standing by the fire with the book clutched to her chest and her heart pounding. Christmas Day dawned clear and brilliant, the storm having blown itself out overnight. The entire town of Silverstone emerged to dig out from the snowdrifts, and the boarding house residents spent a peaceful day enjoying leftovers from the previous night's feast and reading aloud from Elizabeth's new book of poetry. Xavier did not appear, and Elizabeth tried not to feel disappointed, knowing his duties would be especially important after such a severe storm. But as twilight approached, Mrs. Peterson called her to the kitchen, where a young boy from the livery stable stood stamping snow from his boots. "Message for Mrs. Bentley," the boy announced, handing her a folded piece of paper before dashing back out into the cold. Elizabeth unfolded the note with trembling fingers, recognizing Xavier's bold handwriting. "Elizabeth, urgent news. Must speak with you immediately. Will call at the boarding house at 7 o'clock. X. Kincaid." The formal tone and brevity of the note alarmed her. Had something happened at her homestead? Were there problems with her sheep? Or was it something more personal? Had she misinterpreted his gift, his kiss? At precisely 7 o'clock, Xavier arrived, his expression grave as Mrs. Peterson showed him into the small sitting room where Elizabeth waited anxiously. "What's happened?" she asked as soon as they were alone. Xavier removed his hat, turning it in his hands. "The bandits who killed Charles, we caught one of them. The youngest of the gang was wounded in a failed stagecoach robbery near Fort Pierre. Before he died, he confessed to several crimes, including the murder of your husband." Elizabeth sank onto the nearest chair, her knees suddenly weak. Did he say why? Was it just for the woolen wagon? Xavier hesitated, and Elizabeth knew instantly there was more to the story. The truth might be painful, Elizabeth. Tell me, she insisted. I need to know. Xavier sat beside her, his expression somber. According to the dying man, your husband wasn't just in town to sell wool. He'd been meeting with a lawyer from Bismarck about selling your homestead. He had cash from an advance payment, more money than he should have been carrying. Elizabeth stared at him in disbelief. That's impossible. Charles would never sell our land without telling me. That homestead was everything to him, to us. The lawyer confirmed it, Xavier said gently. Charles had initiated the sale a month earlier by mail. The buyer was a representative from the railroad. They're planning a line through the territory, and your land sits along the proposed route. Elizabeth's mind reeled. Could Charles have kept such a significant decision from her? They had struggled on the homestead, certainly, but he had always insisted they would make it work. Unless he had seen what Elizabeth had only begun to accept after his death, that their dream of prosperity in Dakota Territory had been built on false hope. I don't understand why he wouldn't tell me, she whispered. Xavier took her hand, his touch warm and steady. The lawyer said Charles spoke of surprising you with a new start. He'd arranged to purchase a small business in Bismarck, a tailor shop, where your sewing skills would be valuable. The revelation struck Elizabeth like a physical blow. Charles had been planning their escape from the hardships of homesteading, planning a future that acknowledged her abilities rather than constantly testing her physical endurance, and he had died before he could share that future with her. Tears spilled down her cheeks, and Xavier silently offered his handkerchief. I'm sorry, Elizabeth. I debated whether to tell you, but I thought you deserved the truth. Thank you, she managed through her tears. I needed to know. They sat in silence for several minutes, Xavier still holding her hand, offering wordless comfort as she processed this new understanding of her husband's final actions. Finally, Elizabeth wiped her eyes and straightened her shoulders. What happens to the homestead now? Is the sale still valid? No, Xavier assured her. Charles never signed the final papers. The land is still yours to do with as you choose. Elizabeth nodded, a strange sense of calm replacing her earlier turmoil. I need time to think. Of course. Xavier stood to leave, then paused. There's one more thing. The dying bandit gave up the location of their hideout in the Black Hills. Marshal Harrison is organizing a posse to go after them. I'll be leaving with them the day after tomorrow. Elizabeth felt a fresh wave of fear wash over her. How long will you be gone? A week, perhaps 2. It depends on the weather and whether they're still at the hideout. Xavier's expression was resolute. These men have terrorized the territory for too long. We need to bring them to justice for Charles and for all their victims. Elizabeth wanted to beg him not to go, not to risk his life pursuing dangerous criminals in the treacherous winter conditions of the Black Hills. But she recognized the determination in his eyes, the same commitment to duty and justice that had first brought him to her homestead with news of Charles's death. Be careful, she said instead. Please. Xavier's expression softened. I will. He hesitated, then added, when I return, we should talk about the future, your future, and perhaps ours. With that tantalizing suggestion hanging in the air, he bid her good night, leaving Elizabeth with a tumult of emotions, grief for Charles and the future he had planned for them, fear for Xavier's safety, and a treacherous, fragile hope for what might lie ahead if he returned safely. The posse departed 2 days later as promised, a group of 12 men, the Marshal Xavier, and 10 volunteers from Silverstone and nearby homesteads. Elizabeth stood with a small crowd of townspeople to see them off, her heart in her throat as Xavier tipped his hat to her before riding east with the others, soon disappearing into the winter landscape. The days that followed were among the longest of Elizabeth's life. She threw herself into work at the boarding house, taking on extra sewing commissions from townspeople, anything to keep her hands and mind occupied. At night, she read from Xavier's book of poetry, finding solace in Emily Dickinson's spare, powerful verses about love, loss, and hope. A week passed with no word from the posse. Then another. The town grew anxious, and rumors spread the men had been ambushed. They had gotten lost in the hills. They had frozen to death in another blizzard that had swept through the region. By the beginning of the third week, Elizabeth could barely eat or sleep. She took to sitting by the boarding house's front window for hours, staring down the snow-covered main street, willing Xavier to appear. On the 18th day after the posse's departure, Elizabeth was helping Mrs. Peterson prepare breakfast when they heard a commotion outside. Both women rushed to the window to see riders approaching from the east, bedraggled, exhausted men on equally tired horses. Elizabeth threw on her coat and hurried outside without bothering with a bonnet, scanning the group desperately for Xavier. Marshal Harrison led the procession, followed by most of the volunteers. She counted them as they passed 9, 10, 11. Where was the 12th? And then, at the back of the group, she saw him, Xavier, slumped in his saddle, his coat stained with what looked horribly like blood. Elizabeth ran toward him, heedless of the snow and ice, reaching his horse just as he began to slide sideways from the saddle. "Xavier!" she cried, helping to break his fall as several townsmen rushed to assist. "Elizabeth," he murmured, his face alarmingly pale. "You're a sight for sore eyes." Dr. Simmons, the town's current physician, pushed through the crowd. "Get him to my office immediately," he ordered, already assessing Xavier's condition with a professional eye. Elizabeth followed as 4 men carried Xavier to the doctor's small office and surgery at the end of Main Street. Inside, Dr. Simmons cut away Xavier's coat and shirt to reveal a crudely bandaged wound in his left shoulder. "Gunshot," the doctor declared. "Not recent, I'd say about a week old. It's infected." Elizabeth's knees threatened to buckle. "Will he?" "Hard to say," Dr. Simmons replied bluntly. "Fever's high. I'll need to clean the wound thoroughly and hope the infection hasn't spread too far." He glanced at Elizabeth's stricken face and softened slightly. "He's strong, and he made it this far. That's in his favor." The next hours were a blur as Elizabeth assisted the doctor, boiling water, preparing bandages, and holding Xavier down when the pain of cleaning the wound roused him to semi-consciousness. By evening, Dr. Simmons had done all he could, removed the bullet fragments, cleaned and re-bandaged the wound, and administered what medicines he had to fight the infection. "Now we wait," he told Elizabeth. "Someone should stay with him through the night to monitor the fever and give him water when he's conscious enough to swallow." "I'll stay," Elizabeth said immediately. The doctor eyed her critically. "You look ready to collapse yourself, Mrs. Bentley." "Please," Elizabeth insisted. "I need to be here." Dr. Simmons finally nodded. "Very well. I'll check in every few hours. If his fever spikes higher or if he starts having trouble breathing, call for me immediately." Left alone with Xavier, Elizabeth pulled a chair close to his bed and took his hand. His skin felt hot and dry, his breathing shallow but steady. In the lamplight, his face appeared gaunt, with several days' growth of beard shadowing his jaw. "Don't you dare die on me, Xavier Kincaid," she whispered fiercely. "Not when you promised we would talk about our future." Throughout that long night, Elizabeth bathed Xavier's face and neck with cool water, spooned broth between his lips when he was lucid enough to swallow, and prayed as she had never prayed before. Sometime before dawn, exhaustion overcame her, and she fell asleep with her head resting on the edge of his bed, her hand still clasping his. She woke to the sensation of fingers gently stroking her hair. Opening her eyes, she found Xavier watching her, his gaze clearer than it had been since his return. "You're still here," he murmured. Elizabeth sat up quickly, pressing her palm to his forehead. The skin felt cooler, the raging fever diminished. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been trampled by a buffalo," Xavier admitted with a weak smile. "But better than yesterday." Relief washed over Elizabeth in a dizzying wave. She blinked back tears as Dr. Simmons entered to examine his patient. "The fever's breaking," the doctor confirmed after checking Xavier's wound and pulse. You're not out of danger yet, Deputy, but I believe you'll recover, provided you follow my instructions and rest completely for at least 2 weeks. Over the next several days, Xavier's condition improved steadily. He was moved from the doctor's surgery to a room at the boarding house where Elizabeth and Mrs. Peterson could care for him more easily. As his strength returned, he shared the story of the posse's mission with Elizabeth during her frequent visits to his room. They had found the bandit hideout just where the dying man had indicated, high in the Black Hills in an abandoned mining camp. The ensuing gunfight had been brutal, with Xavier taking a bullet early in the confrontation. Despite his injury, he had continued fighting until the remaining bandits, 3 hardened criminals responsible for a dozen murders across the territory, were captured or killed. "We brought 2 back alive," Xavier explained. "They're in the jail at Fort Pierre awaiting trial. They'll hang for what they did to Charles and the others." Elizabeth sat beside his bed, sewing a new shirt to replace the one ruined by his wound. "I'm glad there will be justice," she said quietly, "but I'm more glad that you survived to tell me about it." Xavier reached for her hand, halting her sewing. "I thought of you every day we were gone," he confessed. "When I was shot, when the fever set in during the journey back, it was the thought of seeing you again that kept me fighting." Elizabeth's heart hammered in her chest. "Xavier, I know it's too soon," he continued, his eyes never leaving hers. "I know you're still grieving Charles, but I can't pretend I don't have feelings for you, Elizabeth. Strong feelings." Elizabeth set aside her sewing, suddenly certain of what she needed to say. "When Charles and I married, it was a practical arrangement. We cared for each other, respected each other, but what we had was built on shared goals rather than passion." She took a deep breath. "What I feel for you is different. It frightens me how different it is." Xavier's grip on her hand tightened. "I don't want to rush you. I can wait." "I don't want to wait," Elizabeth interrupted, surprising herself with her boldness. "Life is too uncertain out here. We've both seen how quickly everything can change. If these past months have taught me anything, it's that we must grasp happiness when we find it." A slow smile spread across Xavier's face, transforming his features despite the lingering evidence of his ordeal. "Are you saying what I think you're saying, Elizabeth Bentley?" "I'm saying that I care for you deeply, Xavier Kincaid. And when you're well enough to have that conversation about our future, I'm ready to listen." Xavier tugged gently on her hand, drawing her closer until their faces were inches apart. "I think I'm well enough for at least part of that conversation right now," he murmured, before closing the distance between them with a kiss that started gently but quickly deepened as Elizabeth responded with all the emotion she had been holding back. When they finally parted, both breathless, Xavier grinned. "Dr. Simmons might disagree about my recovery rate, but I suddenly feel much improved." By early February, Xavier was fully recovered and back on duty, though Marshal Harrison insisted he limit his activities to in-town matters for another few weeks. This restriction suited Xavier perfectly, as it allowed him to spend more time with Elizabeth, whose initial bold declaration had led to a courtship that was the talk of Silverstone. They took advantage of mild winter days to walk along the cleared streets, visited Elizabeth's sheep at the livery stable, and spent evenings reading aloud from Xavier's book of poetry in the boarding house parlor. As they grew closer, Elizabeth shared more about her life with Charles the Good and the Difficult, and Xavier told her about his nomadic existence before settling in Dakota Territory. "I never stayed anywhere long enough to put down roots," he admitted as they sat by the fire one evening. "After the war, it felt safer that way. No attachments, no one to lose." "What changed?" Elizabeth asked. Xavier's gaze was steady on hers. "I met you." By March, as the first hints of spring began to soften the harsh winter landscape, Xavier and Elizabeth had made their plans. They would marry in April, once the roads were passable enough for the circuit preacher to visit Silverstone. They would sell Elizabeth's homestead, not to the railroad, but to a young couple newly arrived from Minnesota who dreamed of farming the fertile prairie soil. With the proceeds, they would purchase a small house on the edge of town, Xavier would continue as deputy marshal, while Elizabeth would open a dressmaking shop in a vacant storefront on Main Street, combining her considerable sewing skills with the business acumen she had developed managing the homestead. As for Charles's memory, Elizabeth had come to a place of peace. She would always honor what they had shared, but she understood now that the greatest tribute to his memory was to embrace the future he had ultimately wanted for her, a life of greater security and the opportunity to use her talents. On a surprisingly warm day in late March, Xavier surprised Elizabeth with a picnic lunch and a ride out to her homestead. They hadn't visited since she'd moved to town before Christmas, and Elizabeth felt a curious mixture of emotions as the familiar buildings came into view: nostalgia, sadness, but also a sense of closure. "I thought you might want to collect any remaining personal items before the new owners take possession next month," Xavier explained as he helped her down from her horse. Elizabeth nodded, squeezing his hand gratefully before approaching the cabin. Inside, dust motes danced in the sunlight streaming through the windows. The furniture remained as she had left at the table where she and Charles had taken their meals, the chairs they had brought all the way from Pennsylvania, the bed where she had spent so many lonely nights after his death. Moving through the small space, Elizabeth gathered the few precious items she had left behind: a daguerreotype of her parents, Charles's pipe that she'd been unable to part with, a quilt her grandmother had made. Each object carried memories, but the pain of those memories had dulled, replaced by a gentle acceptance. As she completed her circuit of the cabin, Elizabeth noticed Xavier standing in the doorway, watching her with a mixture of tenderness and concern. "Are you all right?" he asked. Elizabeth looked around the cabin one last time, then smiled at the man who had unexpectedly brought love back into her life. "Yes," she said with certainty. "I'm ready to go home." They married on a perfect spring day in April, with wildflowers blooming across the prairie and meadowlarks singing from every fence post. The entire town turned out for the ceremony in Silverstone's small church, followed by a celebration at the boarding house where Mrs. Peterson had outdone herself with a feast worthy of the occasion. As they danced under the stars to music provided by the local fiddler and his sons, Xavier pulled Elizabeth close. "Happy?" he murmured against her ear. Elizabeth looked up at the man who had first come to her as the bearer of tragic news and had become her greatest blessing. "More than I ever thought possible," she answered truthfully. Later that night, as they stood on the porch of their new home, a modest but sturdy house with a view of both the town and the open prairie beyond, Xavier slipped his arm around his new wife's waist. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "when I first rode out to your homestead to tell you about Charles, I never imagined we'd end up here. I just knew I couldn't bear the thought of you being alone out there." Elizabeth leaned into his embrace, remembering those dark days of grief and isolation. "You saved me," she said simply. Xavier shook his head. "No, Elizabeth, you saved yourself. I just had the good sense to recognize an extraordinary woman when I met one." As spring gave way to summer, Elizabeth's dressmaking business flourished, attracting customers from surrounding homesteads, and even the occasional stagecoach passenger passing through Silverstone. Xavier continued as deputy marshal, earning a reputation for fairness and integrity that extended throughout the territory. Together, they built a life that combined the best of both worlds, the community and security of town life, with regular rides out to the open prairie that both had come to love. They hosted Sunday suppers for friends, including Mrs. Peterson and the young couple who had purchased Elizabeth's homestead. They planted a garden that yielded vegetables for their table and flowers for Elizabeth's workroom. And on crisp autumn evenings, they still read poetry by the fire, treasuring the quiet moments together between Xavier's duties and Elizabeth's busy shop. One such evening in October, exactly 1 year after the blizzard that had marked Elizabeth's first Christmas in town, Xavier returned home later than usual, his expression unreadable as he hung his hat by the door. "Is everything all right?" Elizabeth asked, setting aside her sewing. Xavier smiled mysteriously. That depends. How would you feel about having company for supper tonight? Before Elizabeth could question him further, there was a knock at the door. Xavier opened it to reveal a young woman with auburn hair and Elizabeth's green eyes, a face she had not seen in nearly 7 years. "Margaret?" Elizabeth gasped, rising so quickly she knocked over her sewing basket. "Hello, Lizzie," her younger sister said, tears streaming down her face. "I hope it's not too late to accept your invitation." Elizabeth looked bewildered from her sister to her husband. "I don't understand." Xavier guided Margaret into the house, closing the door against the autumn chill. "When you mentioned that your last letter to your sister in Chicago was returned, marked address unknown, I made some inquiries through the Marshal's network. It took months, but we finally located her in St. Louis." "I've been looking for you too," Margaret explained, embracing Elizabeth tightly. "After James died of consumption last year, I tried writing to your old Philadelphia address. When those letters came back, I didn't know where to turn." Elizabeth could barely comprehend that her sister, her only living blood relative, whom she had believed lost to her forever, was standing in her home. "How did you find her?" she asked Xavier, still clinging to Margaret's hand. "I wrote to every marshal's office between here and Chicago," Xavier explained. "Eventually, word reached a deputy in St. Louis who recognized Margaret's name from the boarding house where she's been staying." Elizabeth turned to her husband, overwhelmed by this final extraordinary gift. "You did this for me? Without even telling me, in case it came to nothing?" Xavier's expression was one of pure love. "I would do anything for you, Elizabeth. You know that." As the sisters reconnected over supper, sharing stories of their separate journeys west and the hardships and joys they had experienced, Elizabeth felt a sense of completion she had never expected to find in this life. Her past and present had been reconciled, her losses balanced by new blessings. Later that night, after Margaret had been settled in their guest room, Elizabeth and Xavier stood on their porch, looking up at the stars scattered like diamonds across the vast Dakota sky. "Thank you," Elizabeth said simply, knowing no words could adequately express her gratitude. Xavier drew her close, pressing a kiss to her temple. "When I told you that day at your homestead that you'd have company for supper tonight, I never imagined how long it would take to fulfill that promise. But some promises are worth waiting for." Elizabeth smiled, thinking of all the unexpected turns her life had taken, the sorrows and joys, the endings and beginnings. "Yes," she agreed, turning in his arms to kiss him properly. "Some promises are definitely worth waiting for." In the years that followed, Elizabeth and Xavier's life together continued to evolve and flourish. Margaret decided to stay in Silverstone, eventually opening a small school that complemented Elizabeth's dressmaking business. The railroad did come through the territory, though it passed 5 miles south of Elizabeth's former homestead, sparing the young family who now farmed the land from displacement. Silverstone grew slowly but steadily, becoming known for its relative safety and stability in a region still marked by occasional lawlessness. Much of that reputation was due to Xavier's continued work as deputy marshal, and later, after Marshal Harrison's retirement, as marshal himself. Elizabeth's dressmaking shop expanded to include a small department of ready-made clothing, employing several local women and becoming a social center for the town's female population. Between her business success and Xavier's position, they became respected pillars of the community, often hosting gatherings at their home for holidays and special occasions. Their family grew as well. In the spring of 1879, Elizabeth gave birth to a son they named Thomas Charles Kincaid, a strong, curious boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's determined spirit. 2 years later, twin daughters Sarah and Jane completed their family, filling their home with the laughter and chaos that Elizabeth had once feared she would never experience. Through it all, the daily joys and challenges of marriage, parenthood, and community leadership, Elizabeth and Xavier remained each other's strongest supporters and most passionate advocates. They never forgot the unlikely circumstances that had brought them together or the precious second chance they had been given. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Xavier surprised Elizabeth with a journey back east to Philadelphia, where they visited her parents' graves and showed their children the city where their mother had grown up. It was a pilgrimage of sorts, a way of honoring the past while celebrating the present. "Did you ever imagine your life would turn out this way?" Xavier asked as they stood on the deck of the steamboat carrying them back west, the children asleep in their cabin below. Elizabeth thought of the young woman who had left Philadelphia with Charles all those years ago, full of trepidation and fragile hope. She thought of the widow who had stood on her porch with a shotgun as a deputy brought news that would shatter her world. And she thought of the woman she had become stronger, more resilient, more deeply capable of love than she had ever believed possible. "No," she answered honestly, leaning into the shelter of her husband's embrace as they watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "But I wouldn't change a single step of the journey that brought me here to this moment, with you." Xavier's arms tightened around her waist, his lips brushing the curve of her neck. "Nor would I, my love, nor would I." As night fell and stars appeared in the darkening sky, Elizabeth silently thanked whatever fate or providence had guided her through loss to this unexpected happiness. The road had been longer and more difficult than she could have imagined, but standing here with Xavier, their children sleeping safely nearby, she knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The journey west had not been the end of her story, as she had once feared in those dark days after Charles's death. It had been merely the beginning of a far greater adventure, one that would continue to unfold day by day, season by season, in the life she and Xavier had built together on the vast, beautiful, unforgiving land they now called home.